purposes only and does not constitute investment advice or a solicitation to buy or sell securities. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and may not reflect future outcomes. Investing in early-stage companies involves significant risk, including potential loss of capital and illiquidity. Listeners should conduct their own due diligence and consult professional advisors before making any investment decisions. Welcome to the Eye Opener podcast. I'm James Murray.
I'm Michael Nissen.
And I'm Faraz Rahal.
On today's show, we're going to revisit a virtual discussion we hosted a while back. Clear Talk Live explored early-stage ophthalmic innovation. It was done right around the time of our 10th anniversary. So before we kick off, let's take a few minutes to reflect on over 10 years of ExSight. First of all, I can't believe it's been that long. And we're coming up on 11 years. So you guys have any reflections on all that time?
James, I think the time I've spent working on ExSight with you guys is some of the most satisfying time I've spent in my career. Coming together with you guys and refining our common goals to find new and important technology in eye care and bringing that eye care to patients and creating profit for investors and building our company is incredibly successful. We've been able to identify areas of need, which we did early on, and fill a lot of those areas of need very specifically with the best companies and very, very importantly, the best teams able to bring that technology forward. And in terms of learning for us, we've learned just how important the team is and the entrepreneurs who build the team in getting technology to the patients. And it's been a great run. I look forward to doing this for a lot longer with you guys.
Awesome.
Yeah, I agree with every one of those sentiments. This has been an unbelievably fun and gratifying ride over these last 10 to 12 years. The fun part, it's hard to kind of put into words, but we have so much collegiality, and we're doing so many what we consider, and I think the world would consider, important things, trying to bring these great products to patients ultimately. And the learning, I think, has been incredible for me to have taken clinical knowledge and what was clinical trial knowledge and learned how to put that into an investment strategy and an investment thesis and help companies to develop from scratch is a whole new skill set that we studied hard and I had to learn in the beginning, and it's been incredible, and I've learned a lot from the two of you and from so many of our colleagues and guests and the management teams who we've helped along and who've helped us.
Yeah, I mean, not a surprise, and probably something that's consistent with the Clear Talk episode we're about to jump into, is that we agree. We all agree on that. And, to each of your points in talking about team and collegiality and the ability to work with each other, learn from each other, I think it really underscores how important having a strong team that works well together is, right? And represented both by ourselves and the challenges that we've had in facing ExSight. Tried to build it up from nothing and really bootstrap like many of our companies do, right? We didn't have a seed investor with $50 million in the bank. We bootstrapped this from our own capital and have moved on. And the team dynamic matters so much as you face those challenges.
I apologize, James. I've been holding back on that extra $50 million.
It's 11 years. Do we get it for the 11-year anniversary? Is that
I think if you started with the 50 and you were holding it since then, I think we've compounded that to about 85. So you're gonna have to pony up.
Yeah, well, inflation's going to cost more to move these companies along anyway, so yeah. It's a good time. Yeah, no, it's been great, and I'm excited to kind of parlay our conversations, again, into this format and share it with some of our colleagues, founders, innovators in the space. But this week's episode is just us talking about what we look for in innovation in companies. Please subscribe, like, review, share, and now on to the episode. Everyone, thanks for joining us this evening, and welcome to the first episode of Clear Talk Live, a new discussion series hosted by ExSight Ventures. The series will focus on early stage innovation from various perspectives through discussions with key stakeholders from across the innovation spectrum, researchers to founders, strategic partners. And tonight we'll dive into the world of early stage ophthalmic innovation from our perspective as a venture capital firm dedicated to investing in the space and bringing transformative technologies to patients and clinicians. Innovation, of course, requires multiple inputs, including but not limited to idea, execution, resources, and of course, capital. That is, of course, where we come in. Tonight, we'll begin by briefly discussing our origin story as it relates to supporting early stage innovation, then moving on to the insights generated by having two practicing surgeons as members of the GP and our process. We'll use a few case studies to illustrate our investment process. And finally, we'll finish with a few areas that we're excited about for the next 10 years. With that, I'm going to turn to Michael, as ExSight was in many ways an outgrowth of his desire to advance the field of ophthalmology through innovation. Michael, walk us through that. Where were you in your career, and what insights led you down this path all the way back in 2013?
Thanks, James. So I'm Michael Nissen. I'm a vitreoretinal surgeon at Cornell and in private practice since 1998, very involved in the fellowship training. After about 15 years of treating patients and doing and teaching vitreoretinal surgery, I felt I had a very significant impact, but that I'd hit a limit and that what I was doing didn't scale. I wanted more. So I thought a lot about the need for innovation in ophthalmology. I talked with all kinds of people from all sorts of business and medical jobs. And after about a year more of discussion and thinking about what might work, I centered on the idea of creating a venture fund for eye care. I then was connected with James by a friend who was just beginning a career in venture. And after talking with James, I realized that I really needed another doctor for more perspective. And immediately I thought of Dr. Firas Rahal, who you'll meet in a minute, who trained me in retina surgery years before at Cornell and flew out to LA. And for reasons you're all going to see tonight, you will see why Firas is the perfect partner for this venture.
Thanks, Michael. That's very kind and generous. He's even generous about the teaching part. He didn't need that much teaching, but that was fun. I'm a vitreoretinal surgeon, as you heard. I'm in Los Angeles. When Michael came and proposed, James, the idea to me, you guys had already spoken about it. It was a new idea to me for sure. I'd never really thought about this part of the business a whole lot, but I was in many parts of the business. I mean, ophthalmology business, ophthalmology product development business, in many other ways. I was, again, then in a very busy vitreoretinal surgery practice. It's one of the biggest in the country, actually, and we're centered here in Los Angeles. And on account of that, I was very heavily involved in clinical trials. All this still goes on, but I'd really gained a lot of experience in clinical trials and was starting to take on fairly significant amounts of advisory roles with mostly large pharma at that time. I do more with small pharma now through some of our work together, but it seemed a natural fit when he proposed it to me, having done those things and seen where some of the great opportunities are in ophthalmology development, and also where a lot of the shortfalls and the pitfalls are when you look at how strategics bring products along. And I was and continue to advise strategics. A lot of my friends work in that side of the business, and they're really smart people, but there's definitely holes in the system. And when Michael proposed this, it was very appealing to me. And I think the part that was most appealing, other than the fact that it was Michael, and I can't think of a nicer, smarter, more ethical person to partner with, was that I liked the idea of taking all that information that I was sort of gathering for 20 years in the business and go into company building, which is a part that's separate and different from being an advisor and being a clinical trials expert, let's say, or someone who designs clinical trials or helps. Company building is another level, but it incorporates a lot of those things. And I thought that I could bring value based on some of those experiences. And it's been a lot of fun. And I think it's turned out the way I'd expected. So it was a real pleasure for me to take it on. And in the beginning, I was a little nervous about knowing enough to do it.
That's great. That's really, really helpful context. And for me, when I met Michael, the innovation, I didn't think it would ever work, right? I said, venture is hard enough. Life science is even more challenging. Early stage is exponentially more difficult, particularly in healthcare and life science investing. And now you want to focus on this one little area of the body. But the innovative part to me was, if you look at the tech ecosystem, being now 70 years old and famously starting in Silicon Valley, and the biotech ecosystem, which is much younger by about 30 to 40 years. As the tech ecosystem developed, you had the very large incumbent Sand Hill Road venture firms, the Kleiners of the world and others, kind of not give way, but also see that ecosystem grow such that there were early stage dedicated funds that had differentiation and specialization, famously kind of Ribbit Capital in fintech and Fifth Wall in prop tech, not relevant, neither of which are relevant to tonight, except when you think about that model, right? Within healthcare life sciences, we continue to develop and advance. We have the large funds, but they need to write $30 to $50 million checks minimum to move the needle. And they're mostly generalists, not specialized. So then how do you solve for that early stage kind of risk capital? And we decided to do that through specialization, which is where Michael and Frost's experience comes in. So we ask these questions and kind of tell the story to set the table on where innovation comes from. And let's talk about that as it relates to our process. Excel, you can tell that I take a lot of my cues from the tech world. The venture firm became known for their approach to investing with a thesis-based method called the prepared mind. And I think we inadvertently stumbled into a similar style in some of our early conversations, when I was fairly skeptical about whether or not there was a model here. And I was asking you guys to convince me why ophthalmology was interesting as an investment space. What innovations were coming and where was the great need? So, Michael, how did your practice influence our investment process early on and, in fact, still to today?
Well, I think also it was clear to me that ophthalmology is particularly dynamic, and that figured into a lot of our early discussions. Ophthalmologists can move quickly, implementing new ideas, et cetera. For me, being in full-time clinical practice, it was easy to identify areas of need within eye care. And so I think in about one day, we sat down and figured out a bunch of slots that would be important to fill if we were really going to have a big impact in eye care. And then for the next 10 years, we worked to fill those areas of need with investments into the best companies solving for the problems that we initially identified. Often looking at dozens of companies in each area of need to identify the best candidates before making investments, and following some of these companies for years. This was a very different process from things I'd been asked to do before, and for us, probably even more so than I was, in evaluating specific investments and ideas. This was looking into whole spaces and trying to see the whole spectrum of companies and pick the best ones. So really very different, and but driven by our understanding of the clinical need.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's that understanding of the clinical need that's so important. And, Michael, you mentioned something worthwhile, is the ability to kind of diversify that risk profile across all various spectrums of ophthalmology, not just therapeutics, but also devices and diagnostics, which is part of our strategy. So for us, why is it busy then to have why is it important then, rather, to have an experienced, busy clinician as a member of the GP with real skin in the game, rather than only serving as a consultant, which you both have done, continue to do, and did so prior to ExSight?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with everything Michael said, and it was exactly the process as I recall it too, and it didn't take long to identify the areas of need. And I think consultants can give you that too, that there's a lot of overlap between serving companies as an advisor or consultant and being, say, an investor GP, but there are some clear differences too. The overlap is knowledge of product development in ophthalmology and how that's done, the process by which clinical trials are administered, and commercialization may or may not be successful. But there's some key differences. Advisor role, for example, if you're advising a company, and those are the same people that might, in some circumstances, advise an investment company as well. But if you're advising a company, your job is sort of primarily very encouraging. you're trying to encourage the company to move along and then help them devise their trial, perhaps, and in some ways even helping with messaging. And sometimes messaging, I don't want to be too cynical here, sometimes the point of messaging is to perhaps bury flaws or hide them, or try, not necessarily to be deceptive, but you're not going to highlight the flaws when you're their advisor and you're trying to help them move their product along. And the converse of that is, as an investor who comes from the same space, your job is to be much more critical of the management team, even if necessary, critical of the development timeline, have some doubts, and to assess risk in a really more quantitative way and a more objective way. Even if you do see the positives that are being pitched to you, you have to be insightful into looking into the negatives. And sometimes, having served or continuing to serve as an advisor on the other side of these things, not with the same companies, obviously, but you might recognize as a GP, now you have, again, to use your term, skin in the game, you might be able to really recognize when that messaging may be not the best signal of certain flaws in the company or their development plan. And again, it's not to be cynical, but it's to be critical.
That's great. That's really helpful. And I think, one of the other important things to mention is that we invest alongside of all our investors into each of the funds. And then we become a fiduciary to those investors. And these are, again, it's not just our money, but it's money from our friends and their investments, hard earned. And so you have a certain responsibility, when you think about your investment in that way, rather than, serving as an advisor, which you owe the duty to the company, of course, and to the team, but you don't necessarily think about it when you're putting money to work, right? It's a different analysis.
Yeah, I mean, an advisor might attend, and this commonly comes up, I've done many of these, might attend a meeting on the request of a company they're advising, and the meeting may be to pitch an investment company, a VC, and so there's clearly a conflict there in that the advisor is really there to help the company pitch their product, and again, will message in a certain way. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the assignment, but that's not exactly what we'd be looking for. We need to be more critical and perhaps see through some of those areas that might be buried within the messaging.
That's right. Absolutely. Which we spend a good amount of time doing. So speaking of that time, Michael, going back to the beginning here, I'm reminded of one of the things you said to me at first, which is you see a few deals every year just by way of your position, and they come across your desk, but really, could you do that at scale? And how much time can you actually spend analyzing the investment case? Maybe you talk to the team and diligence that side of it, and the clinical utility and the science of it. But how do you, look at the investment risk? And even then, as angel investments, you're making one or two offs. Can you talk about that just briefly, and how to think about, the fund investment where we're diversifying risk, mitigating follow-on risk, versus the single investment specifically, and any benefit you saw there early on?
Yeah, it's really a very different thing. We're functioning as essentially an institutional investor. We're looking across the whole space, picking the best companies. We're looking at the team and things like the ability of a company to raise enough of a round so that they're actually going to make it to an inflection point. It's a very different process from just looking at an individual company and making an investment. And one thing we've talked about a lot too is it's not easy to always pull the trigger on an investment, and especially as an individual doctor back when, it was very hard to pull the trigger on an investment when you're looking at one thing. Is this going to win or lose? As an institutional investor, we're looking to make an investment in the space and pick the best one, at which point we're going to pull the trigger. And it hit me early on, and the three of us have discussed this many times. It's like the way we function as a surgeon, right? You're going to do the surgery. You're going to prepare as well as you can and give the patient the best shot, at which point you're going to take the risk and do the surgery if you're going to do any good. And that's a little more like what we're doing here.
That's right. That's right. And I remember you saying that early on. You just got to make a decision and live with it. And base it on all experience and work you've done today. So for
Right.
us, similar question. So getting to yes early on, it's a very different process. So what were your early lessons and some of the things you recall in your transitions from clinicians, clinician scientists to clinician investors? What are the significant differences there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I like the surgery analogy, Michael. That's totally right. It's almost mirrors how we approach surgery with risk assessment and making decisions to perform maneuvers that we know carry risk, but we've done quickly and mathematically the risk assessment and then act. And I think investment is that, and that's a different mindset than I would have had as a clinician alone many years ago, or even clinician scientists with knowledge of clinical trials and how products are brought to market. Find even now when I talk to a lot of my friends who some of which want to invest and do either alone or now with us in many instances, and I had this same view and this same function, is that clinicians are taught to be, we're all taught to be super risk averse. That's part of your job as a physician. You're taking care of people, and it's in your ethos to be super risk averse, almost for investment too risk averse. And I find that if you talk to a clinician about a potential product, even in their own space where they have great knowledge, any flaw, any risk is perceived in a binary way, that there is risk or there isn't risk, and it becomes a no yes question off of any risk. That's not realistic in investment. You're assessing quantitations of risk and balancing them against market size, management team, whether or not you want to be in that space. A whole slew of characteristics go into risk assessment and an investment proposition and value. And I think that's what I've learned over these years. And that's the difference between a clinician scientist investor versus, say, just a clinician scientist. We have to use modeling of risk, be it mathematical or psychological or both, and not just shy away from it. You'll never invest in anything if you're strictly binary about risk. And I do think, at least for me back in the day, that's probably how I would have viewed it. And I think that's how a lot of clinicians view it. So it's hard to be a solo clinician investor, never mind the diversification part of having what was just mentioned, a fund with multiple avenues of investment that diversify a portfolio within ophthalmology, let's say, but also just any one individual investment. I think you can be a little paralyzed by the way we've been taught as doctors to be fearful of risk and become a barrier. And again, we want to mitigate risk, we want to quantitate it, but we can't fear it altogether as a binary entity.
Yeah, that's very well put. And I think there are so many lessons from your field that we use all the time here. And it's not just, oh, what's of need clinically, right? What's relevant? What's this science? Where does it come from? It's also, where's the decision-making process and how are we mitigating that risk? And there's so many analogs within venture, and particularly for us, right? Because our whole reason to be, if you will, is that we're early stage investors, and we want to bridge that. I know Michael doesn't like this term, but that valley of death, right? Where you got all the university investment and the grant funding and the research that happens, and then you've got all the big funds and the strategics looking to feed their pipelines, of course. And then, but there really aren't many early stage investors within healthcare life science that write capital efficient checks. Sure, there's early stage investors that do company creation, but they're putting 30, 40, $50 million to work, and they're often bringing in the asset themselves, which is a very fine strategy, but a lot of innovation happens somewhere in between, right? Where you do have a brilliant founder or a great team that wants to take it forward and really only needs a few $1 million to de-risk that moving forward to the stage at which a generalist becomes interested. And so, for us, I think that those lessons are even more succinct and more meaningful, where we want to be that first institutional check. So we really have to take risk. And then how are we mitigating that? It's not as if we're taking a sort of spray and pray approach where we're putting a few bucks in everything and hoping one of them works out. We're very methodical and building these portfolios, but then mitigating risk as we reserve for follow-on, right? So I think, again, there are just many analogs between how we think about risk as a VC, and then of course you guys as surgeons. So with that said, let's talk about how we fill those different spots within the portfolio. Michael, you want to review some of those areas and what areas were and kind of still ripe for innovation that we identified early?
Sure. I'm just going to hit a few of them that we thought we'd talk about. So drug delivery is one of the most obvious slots of need in ophthalmology. And we spent a lot of time looking at a lot of companies, talking to them over and over, interviewing technical people and CEOs about how they might be able to address what we considered the needs in the space, and ultimately chose Ravana as our first investment in that space. And we have others after long discussions, and their ability, the ability of the team, the experience of the team, and the ability of the team to respond to our concerns and needs, and at least in theory, create a product with parameters that would be acceptable to busy clinicians and to patients. And, that's a while ago we made that first investment, and that has worked out. I mean, they're moving forward with 2 different programs that are excellent. They've weathered problems. They're a flexible company, and we're very involved with this company at this point, which I'll let you guys talk about. But that was one of our earlier investments, and we're very, very pleased with it.
That's perfect, and it's a good transition, to talk about from you guys as clinicians looking at a few deals here or there as an advisor where the companies are presenting the competitive landscape, to then acting as an investor where you're seeing hopefully, the majority of the deal flow and the opportunities within the space, not just as companies, but even earlier than that as research projects at universities. I remember going out to University of San Francisco and looking at a project that wasn't even yet a company necessarily. So there are many of those. So for us, with that context, why wouldn't this necessarily be possible as an individual investor or busy clinician, right? The way we approach investing.
Well, it might be possible, but it's not as plausible, and it's definitely not as likely to be successful. And I think of it in a few of the following ways, and I'll speak specifically about Ravana now, since Michael brought that one up, and that's one of our key original, investment plans, and we executed it with Ravana. This is a drug delivery company, and so it's a platform company. They're going to find ways to deliver different kinds of drugs into different parts of the eye, particularly the posterior segment. I won't go into the science. That's not really the point of your question, but a company like this has to be by definition pretty nimble, and because there's an ever-changing landscape of drugs coming into the marketplace, and they're going to have to find ways to work with multiple drug products potentially, and they're going to have to partner with various drug products for their drug delivery methods to be successful. They'll have to be evolving and able to modify their view of the field and they perceive their entrance into the commercial field will be. And being able to be on the inside of that in the company adds everything. If you're just a sort of clinician investor, an individual investor, you not only don't really have access to that kind of evolving, nuanced information, which is changing and being redirected in real time, you won't be able to follow it, which will make it difficult for you to decide when and how much to follow on your investment, because you don't really know exactly what may be happening at a nuanced level. But more importantly, if you're in the company and you've been able to serve as we have, both of us, Michael and I, are scientific advisors to the company now, and James is on the board of directors, we then can influence in a real way those modifications and those directional changes, those pivots, as I don't love that term either, but as are often used in product development. So your investors who are now in aggregate with you have strong representation in modifying those decisions and influencing those decisions that might be in the best interest of not just the patients, but obviously for us at this earlier stage, ExSight, but also even just having a knowledge of what they're pivoting to and from and towards. It informs your subsequent investment decisions, because it's usually not just one. You got to sort of get in and stay on board. These companies have a long road. So I think it's not impossible for an individual investor, but it's definitely much higher risk because you're sort of in the dark a little bit. We have intimate knowledge of what's happening on a day-to-day basis, literally. And in this company's example, we actually have significant influence on those decisions.
Yeah, and I think just as you talking about that, to talk a bit about Ravana, and we'll talk about this more in a bit, just on the importance of team. Michael, you've already mentioned it briefly, but how important the team is, and particularly that communication that comes from management that engages all of the stakeholders and doesn't call you up when there's a problem, right? It's a continuous process of communication, and as you said, iteration. And because there are millions of decisions that are made between, kind of conceptualization, post-investment, all the way to either an exit or commercialization. So yeah, the team is so important, and that level of communication is critical, as we've come to know very intimately. So that, one of the other areas that I love this story is surgical robotics. Michael, you want to talk a bit about that and how we came onto that?
Sure. So we're early investors in Horizon Robotics, and we led their most recent, I guess you would call it an A round, along with a strategic investor. We identified surgical robotics for ophthalmology as an important need. There's a need for more consistency in ophthalmic surgery, and there's a need to transcend the abilities of raw human surgical ability if we're going to develop new and more advanced treatment for eye disease. We identified the Horizon team very early, because when I originally pitched for us on ExSight Ventures, he and I talked about robotics. One of the first things he did was introduce me to the directors of this company, and way before it was a company at all. And we began talking to them and working with them, and James helped them to shape their business plan, and we advised them, et cetera. And we were able to invest very early and follow on with our investment. And Faraz is now on the board of that company. And we were able to get involved early in what is very sure is the best ophthalmic robotic surgery platform, significantly de-risked and very advanced at this point.
Yeah. So yeah, that brings me back to, saying what areas are interesting, why invest in ophthalmology, and you saying surgical robotics, and for us, no sooner saying, oh, we have to talk to JP. He's developing just such a thing at UCLA, and then talking to him for many years before there was a company. So at that point for us, what is kind of the key aspect when you're dealing with really early stage innovation that may be still at the university level, and how to think about when to actually spin that out for an investment?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an oft-asked question. And I think a lot of academician innovators could use some help and training in this area. These are brilliant scientists that are developing incredible innovations. It's hard for them to have the time in the midst of running a lab and maybe even running a clinic, if they happen to be a clinician like JP Hoopschman, who developed this program over a decade at UCLA. And as Michael said, a good friend of mine, we taught retina fellows and residents together for a decade, and he was sharing information about this project with me from its infancy. And James, your input was very helpful in that. A business sense here is very valuable. The spin out is a kind of a critical moment, as anyone who's done academic medicine that they spun into a company knows. There's a lot that goes into it, some that is way beyond the scope of a short discussion like tonight. But I think the longer you can develop, and this is what JP did, and to his credit, this is his first spin out, and a major one, a major paradigm change in ophthalmic surgery as his first spin out. That's really saying something. He put tons of thought into it. He got lots of consultant information. He got information from guys like us. He waited and he developed the concept. And I encourage this. I would recommend any innovator to do this. Wait as long as you realistically can. There's a number of reasons for that. One is the product is more developed by the time you do spin it out. And so you've developed a lot of technology with non-dilutive capital, which translates immediately into great value for private investors who are going to come in the early stages. And it also translates, because of that, into a much easier a much better chance at actually raising the money, which is where a lot of these spin outs die very early, very early. They just can't raise the funds to build their program, and their development plan stalls, and it becomes a cycle. And I've seen this many, many times, and a lot of my friends are in this line of work, some of them very well-known people that would be known to many people on this call. And they've had home runs and they've had failures, and I think the timing was very critical. So timing is everything. Can you go too late? I don't know. I gave a lot of thought to that when we were discussing this. I suppose you can. First of all, you have to have a university that's willing to work with you. You have to have a good relationship with the tech transfer office. That's a whole nother area of expertise. You need to hire or have advice from legal counsel to know how to interface with the university tech transfer department. They're all very different. They all have different strategies, and some are more aggressive about royalties and percentages, and some are more laissez-faire. You have to understand that part as you move forward. It's, again, very hard for a scientist clinician to know any of this stuff, but they learn it with experience and with help. And you could go too late. I suspect if you go too late, you might end up in a situation with the tech transfer people really more aggressively grabbing on to royalties and percentages that would then make it very unpalatable for private investors when you spin out. So timing is everything. And I think understanding the specifics of your university tech transfer process is also part of this everything. And then separately, knowing once you've spun out, how and when to build a management team. What part do you make full-time and spend the money? What part do you make through consultants and try to save a little money? That's a different discussion, but there's a lot that goes into this in those very first months and year.
Yeah, and you should have that plan before you spin out, right? What does it look like? How much will I need to get to that next phase? You know, for us, as you were talking, I was thinking about when would it be too late? Well, it might be too late. It may be too late if they're all competitive fields, right? No innovation happens in a vacuum. They happen because certain technologies are advancing to a point, and presumably people are publishing on them, right? And so you may keep it there too long while another company is spun out, perhaps in stealth, and you don't know about it, and then they've already kind of usurped any advantage you may have had and spun out. And I'm just thinking about it now. You know, you need a type of escape velocity, right? Of the rocket, you've got boosters for each stages. Well, you need capital for each stage. So you have your seed capital, but what's that really going to get you? Because investors like us, we don't like science projects being on our dime, so to speak. You know, you want to see those clear capital efficient development plans that get you to those milestones, at which point it will become interesting to other investors to want to fund that next phase of development. So, yeah, I like that. We hadn't really talked about it in that context.
You're totally right. The competitive aspect of it, I neglected to mention. That's probably the key reason not to wait too long, is somebody might get ahead of you. And to your point about the science project, you can tell, and we've seen this multiple times. We've been pitched many of these from very solid people with great ideas. Too early can become a real science project, and you can feel it and see it in those early discussions that we've had in the early pitches, which, again, smart people, great idea, but they're still in the kind of science project stage, and it becomes expensive with no real endpoints that can be met in a cost-efficient manner. So those are companies that should have stayed in longer in the university and managed it.
Right, and now you're in no man's land because you're not in the university setting. Sure, they can claw it back, but that's a process that will take years.
It's very difficult and expensive.
Right.
I'll just say, too, that some of those science projects are hard to watch because as clinicians, the ideas are great and exciting, and they don't ever get the chance to really see the light of day and get to the clinic. Yeah. All right. Another area of need that we discussed that's obvious to most people in this call is dry macular degeneration. And we saw and still continue to see tons of patients, tons of companies in this space. And one of the companies we followed for a long time was O&L. Again, we were pitched about this company by the then CEO, but also for us had a personal connection to the clinician innovator, who's a spectacular guy. And everyone understands the extreme need in this slot, especially given the recent approvals of drugs with very limited efficacy, which validate the need. It's a high-risk area with tremendous potential. We stayed in touch with O&L until they made a change in their management that showed us that they could go from a science project to sophisticated company with a serious business plan, able to raise enough money to make milestones. And at that point, we invested. We felt we chose the best team in the space with one of the best technologies. And years later, and a significant number of investment rounds later, it's paying off as the company launches a phase 2 trial. And so that's an exciting one for us. You can talk about them.
Can I just briefly interject on that? Because as you were talking, it reminded me, and I hadn't even thought about this when we were preparing the discussion today, just about when we did start to look at that technology. They had spun out of Michigan pretty early on in their development, and they were struggling with some of their clinical design questions for their first program in RD, and it was working with them and having conversations and iterating over, I think, 2 years, between 2016 and 2018 until we actually made our first investment, right? And so it was only then where they had clearly defined how they were going to use that injection of capital to de-risk the asset and move it forward. So yeah, you kind of have that contrast there, at least early on, between them and Horizon. But obviously they built the plane in the air, so to speak, and have done.
And in addition, along those lines, while they're very experienced as well, they listened to our thoughts for years. We had an impact there before ever really making an investment.
Yeah, and so on that note, for us, I guess we've already touched on it a bit, but from your perspective, how does this kind of illustrate our process, particularly, from your vantage point as having that pre-existing relationship with David Zaks, and how does that help us?
Yeah, so this when I first took on investing as part of my professional life with you guys a decade or so ago, maybe a little more now, you're taught that there are 3 pillars to biotech investment, right? Maybe every kind of investment. What is the market? What is the asset? And what about the management team? Those 3 sort of pillars of investing in this space and any biological or technological space. And this company becomes the prototype as it's currently built for this analysis. The asset, to your point about, my knowledge of it from before, is utterly brilliant. It's a life's work of one of the smartest guys in the retina space. I don't think there's anybody who understands retinal physiology better than David Zaks. And I mean that sincerely. And I think a lot of people would agree with me. And he spent a lifetime, or the part of his career he's led up to now, building the concepts around this FAS inhibition, this method that could be modified or blocked to block cell death, which is ultimately the final common pathway in these degenerative diseases. And I don't mean just retinal degenerative. Retinal degenerative equates to neurodegenerative. So the scale of this, so we move to market, the scale of this is immense. By the way, on the team part, Michael already alluded to it, so I won't belabor it. David Esposito is the current CEO. He's the prototype. His ability to communicate, his affability, his skill, his organization, his knowledge of how to raise money and when to raise money. The list is long. So the management team between the 2 Davids is off the charts. The asset is brilliant. And the market, I won't waste time on. I mean, it's a gigantic market that everybody wants into, and the current methodologies are still pretty suspect. The data is not very compelling for the current treatment models as they are. We're unequivocally going to do much better in the coming years. We think this is going to be one of those advances. And so it checks all the boxes and does so pretty easily.
Pretty easily is right. Massive markets and great team, all of those things, and evidenced again by their Series D just announced last week. And very gratifying for us to have been part of that journey thus far as they go into their phase 2. On that front, we've talked about 3 areas where we've made investments over the years that we've prioritized. as we look ahead, let's talk about some of the areas that we're either still excited about, right? Because we were looking many years into the future when we had that discussion 10 or so years ago, and continue to have frequently, including, let's see, now AI and automation, particularly around where your practices inform your view around these kind of buzzworthy areas that people talk about.
I'll start with something straightforward, and then you guys can go a little more pie in the sky, I think, here. So, one of the things we realized is that it's very difficult to run our practices with the extreme need for tech labor. Tech labor is really a choke point in running these busy practices and running them efficiently. And well, the first company we ever saw together was right when I was pitching for us on ExSight, and he said, "Just a minute, we have to go to this room and see this company." And so we ran off there. It was a lot of fun, and we saw Envision, and Envision is the brainchild of Alex Walsh, who has been working on a system to replace tech help and really replace most of the tech staff in a busy ophthalmic office while actually increasing the speed and the quality of ophthalmic examinations. And when this system is now up and running and can be demonstrated, in fact, the only eye exam I've had in years is on that system, and I'm very happy with it, aside from for us doing a peripheral retina exam on once in a while. And so when we show this system to busy clinicians, they get it right away, instantly. Oh my God, this changes everything. And they are very enthusiastic about it. It takes 8 minutes to demo it, and they're all ready to have it in their office. I want 2 of them right away. For us, invested in this thing 12 years ago. Other investors who we are relying on for funding to get this going don't get it as much. They don't understand why this changes everything. And so other than the fact that this is super exciting, we're excited about the investment and the company, I brought it up to illustrate how early investing in new ideas in a very specific, very small, specific space like ophthalmology can be difficult for general investors, whereas for us, it's very obvious how important this is. It has lots of ophthalmologist investors who are KOLs, et cetera. We really have an advantage within this space as a specialist investment company.
That's right. And you kind of bridge that gap, right, between where you see the future going, where the innovation is happening, and then having that expertise to make that investment and give them some additional credibility to the generalists. Because if I'm a layperson, attorney by training, finance professional, right? If I'm just sitting here without knowing you guys and I see that come across my desk, I say, this is an expensive piece of equipment. How is that going to fit into the CapEx of any particular practice and the equipment replacement cycle? I don't know. It's too complicated to me, right? But having you guys on the team and knowing that this is a real pain point for you guys daily, it just makes that insight that Alex had to start this company so many years ago even more prescient, and also now pressing in that we need to make this happen, right? And need to communicate that to the market to have that next stage of investor come in.
Yeah, James, great and simple point you just made, which is that everyone assumes that we're replacing other pieces of equipment, and that's just wrong. We're replacing staff and the whole method of operations of our clinic.
Frost, what do you have to add to that? Since you made the investment personally before there was an ExSight, Alex works in your offices, right? So, what's your perspective?
Yeah, and we performed one of his principal clinical trials a couple of years back, and our doctors loved it. And I won't spend too much time on just the Envision automation idea. I think you and Michael synopsized it well. This is a great efficiency play. It's a great consistency play. The data generated by it is great, better than human data. We've seen this over and over again. So it has tremendous value to the practitioner in terms of speed and cost and effectiveness. But even if I could for a minute, in the greater AI sort of global view of medicine now, with artificial intelligence coming in, and automation can be and is a part of that, and the Envision device is an automation device with lots of AI needs and components and data collection, et cetera. I think everyone talks about AI for medicine, let's say in ophthalmology in particular, and we're a great space for this, ophthalmology. in its utility for diagnostics. And that's kind of unequivocal. It's low-hanging fruit, training using AI to interpret OCTs or various fundus photographies. And there's a lot of companies in this. It's a very crowded space, but I think it's an important space and has value. But what is kind of being missed, I think, is AI's a great use of AI is going to be really in practice management, practice efficiency, healthcare delivery, access to healthcare. That may be its greater contribution to the immediate needs of healthcare. We just can't treat as many patients as need to be treated. It's almost impossible to get people through in a timely and efficient manner. And so automation, such as Envision, and AI, such as software being designed, I think Devinder Chauhan might be on this call, to help us navigate through patients in a very efficient manner, but not just fast and good. Excellent decision-making, excellent data-driven clinical decision-making that improves patient outcomes, but can probably double or triple the number of patients you can see. And that's not just a financial play for the doctors. There's 7 billion people in the world, and the majority of them don't have access to a retina doctor. So we're going to need to advance the field in how we manage the patients, the actual administration of healthcare itself. And I think AI and automation and robotics being another component of that, for example, will allow us to do this. It's just going to allow us to deliver better healthcare to many more people. So it's not just being able to make an OCT be read automatically, it's decision trees being executed rapidly. It'll allow us to use mid-level professionals, nurse practitioners, physician's assistants, et cetera, to be supervised by, say, the retina clinician or the ophthalmologist, and then triple the volume of patients that can access quality healthcare.
So well said. And there is so much noise right now around AI and so much understandable excitement, but really putting that into practice. And that kind of brings us back to, why do we need innovation in our early thesis? My parting shot for the night would be to add that, right? So what did we identify early? It's just the macro trends. You've got an aging global population. You've got a global explosion of diabetes leading to diabetic eye issues. And then you've got a growing global middle class demanding better access to eye care, not to mention the screens and the explosion of myopia, demanding better access to eye care, but a global shortage of providers, right? And so how do you meet all of those various needs? And you have to do it through technology and innovation, and bringing it back for us to how you actually think about how that plays through clinically and what those needs are, just to put a fine point on kind of the conversation tonight. So you guys have any parting shots? There's one question. We've gone over time, but we might be able to take that.
Are you going to read the question out to
everyone? How can startups best navigate regulatory hurdles and funding gaps to bring new treatments or technologies to market?
That's a big question.
I think that might be our next presentation.
That's a great question, actually, for whoever asked it. I love the question. It's like the $1 million question. I'll take a quick crack at some of that. Navigating regulatory hurdles is a big deal. And for more mature companies, meaning, say, just in the late startup phase, that becomes a very important feature. I think in the really earliest phases of the startup, getting the asset goals nailed down and a development path nailed down, what is the medical, clinical, scientific needs to get it to a product that will work and is commercially viable. Once you're starting to hone that, then I think the best way in this early stage is hire a regulatory consultant. And for those of you out there who are doing this, we have names if people are looking for such a consultant. There's several great ones. They're super good about honing the message down to what the agency, the FDA, would want and what a strategic partner might want, but mostly the former. And then, the latter kind of falls into place because everybody ultimately wants what the FDA is going to demand, but that can be a nebulous endpoint and the goalposts sometimes move. And I think a regulatory consultant becomes valuable in this stage once you've already honed in on the medical messaging and medical development plan. Funding gaps, call James. He's on speed dial for some startups, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean that's our whole reason to be, right? That there are those funding gaps, and they're still exist. They've gotten wider since we started, right? The minimum check size for a lot of those funds was $30 million, but there's an explosion, as many know, through COVID, with fund sizes going over $1 billion. And so now, for those investors to do any work, it's going to take them writing $50 million checks. And a lot that doesn't just breed capital inefficiency, but it overlooks a ton of innovation. And so that's where we are. And we actually welcome the others in the field, and we're a very collaborative relationship with them, because it will only help advance the innovation that we were talking about tonight. And that is a great question. And as we, close out here, having gone a bit long, this is the first in what we're planning as a series. We plan to have different discussions around different issues facing the innovation ecosystem, regulatory being one of them. Maybe we should bring on one of those consultants for our discussion one evening. But for anyone on the call tonight, if you have any ideas, please feel free to recommend them and email any thoughts you have after tonight. I really appreciate it. This is great. Michael, for us, any parting shots for the evening?
Thanks, James. Great job moderating.
Yeah, thank you, James. You always keep things orderly and moving properly. I appreciate you. This was fun, and we're excited to talk to anybody who listened or otherwise that wants to discuss any of these things offline with us. We enjoy it. We actually love what we do, strangely enough.